Okay, where we left off, we were considering the question, is there a moral difference between Singer's pond example and this one, the malaria consortium example? Do we have to treat them, as far as morality goes, alike? In Singer's paper, Famine, Affluence and Morality, he suggests two principles that could explain why you should save the drowning child. First, a strong principle: if it is in your power to prevent something bad from happening without sacrificing anything of comparable moral importance, you ought to do it. And then a moderate principle: if it is in your power to prevent something very bad from happening without sacrificing anything of moral significance, you ought to do it. Okay, so a question for you, it's important to get clear on this. Why might you think that the strong principle seems too strong? Why does the strong principle seem to overreach? Singer points out that in order to secure the result that you ought to give $3,373 to the malaria consortium, Singer doesn't need to assume the strong principle. He just needs to assume the moderate principle. And the moderate principle does seem pretty moderate. If it's in your power to prevent something very bad from happening without sacrificing anything of moral significance, that is, you're not sacrificing another person's life. At best, you're sacrificing the new iPhone or a bunch of dinners at fancy restaurants, then you ought to do it. Singer also points out that if you accept the moderate principle, this has life-changing consequences. Even if we accepted the principle only in its moderate form, he says, it should be clear that we would have to give away enough to ensure that the consumer society, dependent as it is on people spending on trivia like the new iPhone, rather than giving to famine relief, or alternatively to the malaria consortium, would slow down and perhaps disappear entirely. Okay, here's a response in the O'Neill paper, The Moral Perplexities of Famine and World Hunger. So there is Honora O'Neill, who is actually a member of the British House of Lords. She is Baroness O'Neill of Bengarve. And on the right is Immanuel Kant, a German philosopher who lived in the 18th century and who is one of the most famous moral philosophers, and indeed philosophers in general. And Kant is there because O'Neill draws on Kant's moral philosophy to reply to Singer. I will try in this essay, she says, to show how certain moral theories can help us think about some questions about famine. It can also include preventing tropical diseases, and also to use considerations about famine to show some of the strengths and limitations of these theories. Well, what is a moral theory? A moral theory is just a theory of what we ought or ought not to do. Here is the first moral theory that O'Neill discusses: utilitarianism. The first systematic account of utilitarianism was developed by the English philosopher Jeremy Bentham, who was around in the 18th and early 19th centuries. John Stuart Mill, whom we've already met when we talked about Knowledge of Others' Minds, was also a significant utilitarian philosopher. According to utilitarianism, you ought to perform the act that has the best consequences. If you're faced with two options, perform A or perform B, and A has better consequences than B, then you should perform A. What is the best consequence? Well, utilitarianism conceives of that quite narrowly. The best consequence is the one that maximizes happiness or pleasure or subjective well-being. But we could think of the best consequence more broadly. Maybe it's measured in part by the levels of education that people enjoy, or their production of musical and other artistic works, or maybe it's measured in part by the overall level of the gross domestic product, or whatever. If we remain neutral on how to define the best consequence, then the theory is called consequentialism. So utilitarianism is a kind of consequentialism, but there are consequentialist theories that are not versions of utilitarianism. Now, Singer is a utilitarian of some kind, and if we assume that donating about $3,000 to the Malaria Consortium maximizes happiness, then the utilitarian would say that you ought to donate approximately $3,000. However, Singer's argument in Famine, Affluence and Morality does not depend on his utilitarianism, contrary to what O'Neill implies at one point. And that is because his argument depends just on what he calls the moderate principle, not the strong principle. And the moderate principle, you should convince yourself of this, the moderate principle is not a consequentialist principle. A non-consequentialist who thought that when it comes to how you should act, consequences are not the only thing that matter, could nonetheless accept the moderate principle.